Holly Walker.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Well, I'm pleased to take a call straight after the Minister and talk about issues of supply and how they relate to affordable housing. But to situate my comments, first of all, and I think it's agreed probably across the House, we do have a crisis of housing affordability in New Zealand and also a crisis of housing quality. And there's three statistics that I like to quote, Mr Chair, and they all involve the number 7. First of all, over $700,000 is the average house price in Auckland, which is completely unaffordable for your average first home buyer. Secondly, it takes 70% of the average income in Auckland to service the mortgage on a lower quartile house. On a lower quartile house, that's the cheapest quarter. It takes 70% of the average income in Auckland to service that mortgage. And finally, Mr Speaker, 70% of the children living in poverty in New Zealand are living in poor quality private rental houses. So 3 statistics that clearly illustrate the crisis of affordability and quality in our housing in New Zealand. Now, if we turn to part 1 of the bill, we look first at the purpose. And it says that the purpose of the bill is to enhance housing affordability. And it does that by increasing land and housing supply in those areas identified as having housing supply and affordability issues. Well, so far so good, because I agree with the Minister. Supply is very important in the question of housing affordability. That is, the supply of affordable houses is very important in the question of housing affordability. But I'm not convinced by the Minister that land supply actually is the primary problem in the provision of affordable houses. And that's the first problem with this bill, is there is a fundamental mismatch between the problem it sets out to solve, which is housing affordability, it says so right there in the purpose clause, enhance housing affordability, and the solution that it prescribes, which is about increasing land supply. Now, land supply and housing and affordable housing supply are not the same thing, and that is a very important distinction to get clear in this debate, Mr Chairman. Because apart from Auckland, which is the only region in the schedule currently, land supply is primarily not the issue in housing affordability. And we heard that on the committee time and time again as submitters came before us from other parts of the country to say, well, this might be a good prescription for Auckland, though there are some issues with it. But in our part of the country, where yes, we have a housing affordability problem, the problem is not caused by a lack of supply of land. It's caused by other factors, and therefore this bill will not address the housing affordability problems in those other regions. So the prescription in the bill does not work to solve the problem that it sets out to solve. And the Select Committee had to amend Clause 9.3 to insert land supply as one of the criteria for deciding whether to put a region in the schedule, in recognition of the embarrassing fact that it actually was a mismatch. So it's very important that the committee gets that, the House and committee understands that crucial distinction and the fact that the bill is setting out a prescription that doesn't solve the problem that the bill tries to solve. Now, I want to look at the specifics in Part 1, and they're set out in Subpart 2. There's 3 areas I want to look at. First of all, housing accords, how they'll be arrived at. Second of all, what is the definition of a qualifying development and what should be the definition of a qualifying development. And finally, the provisions around the actual conduct and the establishment of special housing areas. So first of all, to look at the housing accords. Now, this part of the bill sets out how the Minister and a territorial authority may enter an agreement to work together to address housing supply and affordability issues. And that's great. It sounds really good. It's absolutely right that local and central government should work together on housing affordability issues. And it sounds very good until you read the fine print, Mr Chairman. But the problem with this whole provision, as my colleague, the Honourable Marion Street, set out in her last contribution, around what can go into a housing accord, is it doesn't actually address the fundamental issues of affordability. But worse than that, it gives a huge amount of power to the Minister to override the work that local councils are doing on this issue and to come in over the top of them and set up a special housing area without their consent and without a housing accord. So it gives the Minister the power to terminate an accord that's been agreed, so they can sit down and negotiate one, work it out, but if there's something about that accord that's not working for the Minister, he can terminate that and go ahead anyway under the conditions that he would like to see. It means that, Mr Chair.
Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It means that effectively it's impossible for councils to enter into good faith negotiations with the government to set up housing accords, because all of the power resides in the minister and in the government, in the central government, because they have the ability, if the negotiations for the accord break down, to just go ahead and set up a special housing area and set up the commissioners to make the decisions about resource consent without any recourse to the territorial authority. So if you were part of that territorial authority, or if one was, sitting down to negotiate with the minister, it's a fundamental power imbalance before the negotiations have even begun. And that was a point made to the Select Committee by countless submitters, many councils from around the country, including the Auckland Council, with whom an accord has already been negotiated, but who are very worried about what this legislation will mean for that accord, including from Local Government New Zealand, the umbrella group for local councils, and including many members of the public who are very concerned about the heavy-handed power that is accorded to central government in these housing accords, in the way that they're negotiated, which effectively makes good faith negotiation impossible. Now, secondly, Mr Speaker, I want to speak about the conditions for a qualifying development, because there are a lot of very technical conditions set out in the bill about what a qualifying development has to do. We spent quite a lot of time in the Select Committee talking about what the definition of predominantly residential was for a qualifying development, which absolutely is important to get correct. But it's a bit like not being able to see the forest for the trees, Mr Chairman, when we bog down in details about the height of a story of a building and what it means to be predominantly residential as we talk about what's a qualifying development for a housing accord. But there's nothing in the provision of the bill about the requirement for affordability, about the bill to require a percentage of affordable housing in a special housing area. And yet that's the problem that the whole bill has set out to solve, Mr Chair. And again, it's a fundamental mismatch between what the bill says it's out to do and what it actually does. So it's a major problem, and it was pointed out by numerous submitters that there is no requirement for affordability to be one of the criteria for a qualifying development in a special housing area. And you'd think it would be when that's the whole purpose of the bill. Now, when we had the second reading, the Minister addressed this point and he said, well, look at the Auckland Accord. There is a minimum requirement for affordable housing in there, so it's all good. And I imagine if he gets up to take another call, he'll probably say the same thing. But, Mr Chairman, the only reason that minimum requirement is in the Auckland Accord is because the Auckland Council pushed very hard for it. If it was up to the Minister, Mr Chairman, it wouldn't be in there at all, and it's not in there in this bill for future housing accords in other areas. So it's not enough for the ministers to say, well, Auckland Council managed to get it in there. There is no guarantee that it will be in any other housing accords negotiated under this bill. Now, this issue of having a minimum requirement for affordable housing in a special housing area is addressed by my colleague Phil Twyford's SOP number 344, and the Green Party will absolutely be supporting that supplementary order paper because we think at the very least the first criteria you should set out for a special housing area under this bill, which seeks to address housing affordability, would be that there is a minimum requirement of affordable housing in that area. Finally, Mr Speaker, I want to look at the special housing areas and the rules that are going to be created for them. Now, this is where the override powers that are given to the Minister in the bill really kick in, and where a lot of the concern came from submitters at the Select Committee, because it gives, in a special housing area, once it's established, if a housing accord isn't negotiated or if one breaks down, it gives the Minister a huge amount of power to appoint the commissioners who make decisions under the Resource Management Act, to set the terms of those decisions, and to approve and fast-track consents which override the provisions of the Resource Management Act. And I imagine that my colleague Eugenie Sage, when she takes a call later on, will talk a lot about the provisions of the RMA and how this bill undermines them. But suffice it for me to say at this point, Mr Chairman, that some of the concerns about the override provision for councils addressed in another supplementary order paper in the name of Phil Twyford number 343, and the Green Party will also be supporting that, because this is a fundamental overriding, it is indeed an override provision, of local democracy, and it's entirely consistent with moves that we've seen from this government in terms of local government on a number of fronts, beginning back with the sacking of Environment Canterbury councillors, but even in this bill as well, a lack of respect for the authority and the autonomy of local government, where if the central government doesn't like what local government thinks or says or does, they will just come in and override it, and that is
Honourable
a big
Annie
problem.
King.
Chairman, just a short while ago,